Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Eisenberg, and I am Valley Memorial Library's Programming and Outreach Graduate Assistant. On behalf of Joe Lucia, Library Director, and the entire staff of Valley Memorial Library, I'd like to welcome you to the final installment in our Scholarship at Villanova lecture series for this fall 2010 semester. We are still looking forward to other great programming before the semester's end, and I'd also like to invite you to our second annual graphic novels event, which is this Wednesday, November 17th at 3 p.m., and featuring John Arcudi, DC and Marvel Comics writer. More information on all events is available on our library's website, library.villanova.edu. Today, we welcome Villanova English Department Professor Alan Drew. Professor Drew's first novel, Gardens of Water, follows a clash between cultures that pits tradition against freedom as two families, one Kurdish and one American, deal with sacrifice and the love that bind them together. Professor Drew was first inspired to explore such intercultural phenomena while teaching in Turkey for 3 years, and some unforgettable events during the course of the novel, including a pivotal earthquake and its aftermath, directly reflect Professor Drew's own experiences while abroad. First published in 2008 and since in countries around the world, Gardens of Water has been praised by School Library Journal as one of the best books of 2008. The Center for Human Rights at the University of Iowa, where Professor Drew was awarded a teaching and writing fellowship and earned his Master's of Fine Arts, named Gardens of Water its One Community, One Book novel, and the city of Pasadena, California, named the novel its One City, One Story book. Here today to discuss and read from Gardens of Water, and also give a glimpse into his upcoming second novel, The Hidden Life, currently in the production stage, we are very pleased to present Professor Alan Drew.
Hi. Is that too loud? Okay, hold on a second. Well, thanks for coming out. Hopefully it'll be worth your while. Thanks, Jeff, for that great introduction. I guess what I'm going to do is I'll read a couple scenes from Gardens of Water, the book that Jeff was just talking about. Try to give you a sort of context for the thing, and then I still haven't quite decided what I'm going to read from that over there, and I'll figure it out sometime between now and then, and I'll read, I think, one scene from the new novel, which is currently titled The Hidden Life, although it's been through various different titles, and my wife and I keep arguing about it. On August 17th, 1999, 7.4 earthquake struck near the industrial heartland of western Turkey. It was about 60 kilometers southeast of Istanbul. It was 7.4 on the Richter scale. It struck at 3 o'clock in the morning when most people were asleep. It lasted for 45 seconds. And I've been through a lot of earthquakes. I grew up in Southern California, and I've never felt anything like this in my life. Literally, the whole world seemed to be shaking, and 45 seconds of that feels like a lifetime. The results of the earthquake, the official numbers of dead from the earthquake were 17,000 people. That would be the number the Turkish government would give you. I've read numbers as high as perhaps, from NGOs, as high as perhaps 40,000 people were killed as a result of the earthquake. The disparity of numbers is because nobody really knows how many people were living in the area, and nobody really knows, they still don't know how many people died from the earthquake. And while this is a horrible natural disaster, obviously, it was also a political disaster. Many of the people that were killed in the earthquake were people that were coming from central Anatolia, who were not able to make a living in central Anatolia anymore in the villages, and they were flooding into the cities. And when they came into the cities, they would move into these condominiums, or these buildings called gece condos, and gece means night in Turkish, and condos means in Turkish to have landed there. And the idea is that these buildings would rise overnight. They were built really quickly. And many of those buildings were built on landfill as well, so when the earthquake struck, all those buildings collapsed and basically turned back to sand. And the only time I saw wanted posters in Turkey, we got there 4 days before the earthquake hit. There were wanted posters around town for a contractor who had been supposedly taking, rather than using the regular sand you're supposed to use for mixed cement, had been going down to the pebbly beaches of the Sea of Marmara and mixing that into with cement. So all these buildings collapsed. And the Sinan Bashioglu, who's the protagonist in the story, is a Kurdish man, and he's one of these people that have flooded into the cities. But he's flooded into the cities not because it's difficult to make a life in the village. He's flooded in because he's a Kurd, and his village has been basically destroyed by the Turkish military in a civil war between Kurdish separatists in the southeast. And he has lost his father. He's been forced from his village to live near Istanbul in one of these gece condos. The book opens up the day of the earthquake, and when I sat down to write this novel, I had no clue what I was doing. So I thought, all right, what am I going to do to make this interesting when it starts to make somebody actually read on? And so for some reason, I came up with the idea that I would start the book on the day of Sinan's son's, Ismail, he's 9 years old, his circumcision ceremony. I don't know why you would do that, but for some reason it seemed interesting, so I apologize to all the guys out there. If you don't know anything about this, when you're a Muslim boy doesn't get circumcised when he's born. He gets circumcised between 7 and 10 years old. And how sort of the traditional way of doing this is that you would take the, if you go to Istanbul, you'll see these boys, you'll see them, they're walking around these little pasha-like outfits, or white satin outfits, look like little sultans, and they have staffs and they have these hats. And what happens traditionally is that the whole family takes the kid around town, and people shower him with gifts and presents, and they throw tinsel in his hair, and they give him candy, and the kid looks really, really happy. But then he has to go home, and they have a big party, and the sunnetchi shows up with an electric knife, and in the house, they perform the ceremony. So the book opens up with this, and Sinan has been taking Ismail out around the city, and I've lost my page because I pulled out my paper. Hold on one second. Here it is. All right. And so they've been taken around the city. He's come back, and they've had the ceremony, had the big party. And Sinan wakes up in the middle of the night. He can't sleep because he's very upset about something. And when his village was destroyed, his father was killed. And he's going to talk about this a little bit. He has some reasons for disliking Americans. And it just so happens that, as I said the story, there's an American couple who live upstairs from them in the same apartment building. And the American is an expat. He's a teacher living in Istanbul. And his wife and his son live above them. His name's Dylan. And Nilüfer had invited them to Sinan's party, to the Sünnet ceremony. And Sinan wakes up and he feels guilty about this. Am I making any sense at all? Right, well, good. If I'm not, just please stop me and tell me. Sinan startled awake from a dream in which his father scolded him for abandoning their village. "My grandson will never know Yeşili, his home," his father had said in the dream, his black eyes staring holes into Sinan. The house behind his father was on fire and it was very hot, and Sinan wanted to tell him this, but he couldn't make his mouth work. The clock next to the bed said 2:45. He kissed Nilüfer on the cheek before getting up in the dark and walking into the front room. In the glow from the streetlights, he saw Ismail there sleeping. A slight breeze blew through the open window, and the few strands of tinsel still stuck in his son's hair sparkled in the wind. He stood next to the bed and listened to the steady rise and fall of the boy's breath. He thought about closing the window. Something about the wind touching his son's sleeping face disturbed him. But it was too hot, and he decided to leave it open. As he pulled the remaining strands of tinsel from his son's hair, Ismail stirred and swatted at the annoyance. His hand stuck there next to his ear, a loose fist with the palm open to the sky. There was an air of the sleeping infant in his pose, and it seemed to Sinan that only days before he had held the baby Ismail in his arms, the small, pudgy body, the toothless gums of his mouth, that fresh, powdery smell of his skin. He climbed the staircase to the rooftop of the apartment building, and from the rooftop he could see over the Americans' terrace, past the other apartment rooftops and their cluttered satellite dishes, and out over the Gulf of Izmit toward the forested hillsides across the water. He stood on the edge of the roof, his shins pressing against the raised edge, and he was surprised to see the American wife below him, sitting alone in a wicker chair. Her back was to him, her face turned towards the black water. She was still except for the rise and fall of her right hand, which held a lit cigarette. For some reason he felt sorry for her, this woman he knew nothing about. She seemed the picture of loneliness at that moment. Her stillness in the dark, the curve of her thick, motherly back, her bare, white legs dully shining in the light of the waterfront. A lot of things were said about these Americans, but if they were so rich, he wondered, why didn't they have their summer home in Yalova with all the other rich people? Goljuk, though by the sea, was a poor town. a working man's town. If they were so rich, why did the wife seem so sad? Maybe he should have been kinder to them at the party. He thought briefly about breaking her silence with a good evening, but decided against it and retreated out of sight to sit on a plastic chair on the rooftop. He often sat on the roof when he couldn't sleep. Since Ajalan had been caught by the government and the civil war in the South seemed over, his father had been visiting him more often in his dreams. His father would have been devastated to hear that the Turks had captured the PKK leader. Without Apo, as Ajalan was called by his father and all separatist-leaning Kurds, the Kurdistan Workers' Party was effectively dead, and so was the movement to carve a Kurdistan out of the corner of Turkey. No one else could kill the paramilitaries the way Apo did. No one else could inspire such fear in the government buildings in Ankara. Perhaps it was safe to return home to Yeşili, but it was difficult to imagine it so. He touched the shard of bullet hanging from a chain around his neck. It was all he had left of his father, God bless him. He remembered the night his father was killed, the popping of the M16 rifle shots, the screaming, the men and boys gathered for the New Year celebration diving away from the bonfires. His father had sent him home when the paramilitary jeeps arrived, and he was already past Emre Bey's butcher shop when his father's friends and the other men began yelling, "Long live Kurdistan," or else he might have been killed too. He felt a sting of guilt about having the Americans in his home. If his father had been here tonight, he wouldn't have stepped into the apartment with them there. The Americans let the Turks do this to us, he would have said, and you now feed them, invite them to your son's most important day? He had dishonored his father's memory, and he would have to suffer the pangs of remorse for giving in to his wife's hospitality. He watched the streak of black water beyond the rooftops, and the city lights strewn around the bay like a necklace. The tea-black sky floated above him, punctured with only 3 stars, just 3 tiny pinpricks. At night in the village, there were more stars in the night sky, more worlds out there staring back than there were people in the whole of the city. Probably more than there were people in all of the world's cities. He wanted to return to Yeşili. He wanted his children to grow up in the shadow of the mountains, but where would he get the money for this trip? How could he leave the business? How would he make a living there? He wanted to explain this to his father, tell him that it was best to stay here, for his children. There was nothing in the South, no jobs, no schools, no future. But even as he built this argument in his head, his father's angry face appeared, and doubt clouded his logic. The breeze felt like air blowing off an open fire. He heard the metal droning of cranes at the docks, a place that never stopped moving. You could hear its machinery grinding away at all hours of the day, during prayers, waking before sunrise in the morning. It didn't matter. The sound was always there, like the scrape of gnashing your own teeth together. He could see a party boat floating close to shore, the white light strung with its bow reflecting against the black water. As they got nearer to shore, Sinan heard the thumping of music from loudspeakers and watched dozens of people dancing on its flat rooftop. The sound was distant and sad, like the echo of some lost pleasure. But as the boat drew closer to the dock, he heard individual voices, the laughter of women, a DJ announcing a raffle, and the clapping of hands. The DJ played another song, and it was so loud that Sinan got angry because he thought it might disturb his family's sleep. Then, there was another sound, an odd, low rumbling, like the shuddering of a tank coming down the street. And at first, that's what he thought it was, one of the police tanks on patrol, but the rumbling grew louder, and it seemed to be rolling across the water toward him, toward the town. He sat up, looked for a ship leaving the docks, searched the sky for a plane, but the sound wasn't right for anything man-made. Then, in the distance, out of the black water, flashed a brilliant spark of green. The flash was so bright that when he blinked, there were little bursts of green blindness in his vision. The rumble had separated itself from the sound of the boat and had become something wholly distinct, a horrible growl. He looked at the party boat, hoping the sound was some new type of music. The shining hull bobbed out there silently, reflecting itself back on the water, but all the dancing people had turned their faces towards the growing sound. Sinan had an instinct to get back to his family. He tried to run for the stairs, tried to get back to them, but his feet skipped out from beneath him, and he found himself face down on the cement rooftop. He rolled onto his back and lifted himself up, but above him the sky shifted, sending the stars falling across the sky, their pinpoints streaking in his vision. He got to his feet and wrapped a fist around a piece of rebar, and when he did, he looked toward the bay where the boat lifted on a wave of water, rose into the air like a toy ship, tipped sideways, listed, and spilled its passengers into the surging sea. There was nothing to think about it because it was something unbelievable, something in a terrible dream, and as soon as he did think they won't make it, the building directly next to his dropped from his vision. The crash was so loud, it was like the silence of blood in his ears. He heard screams, explosions of gas lines rupturing, the bursting of water pipes thrusting up pieces of road, even the sirens of car alarms, but none of these sounds could be isolated. They were simply the cacophonous rush of destruction. Then Sinan's stomach lifted into his throat and he was dropped through the air. For a moment he felt as though he were flying. He looked beneath his feet to find the rooftop falling. It dropped 10 feet and tilted sideways as if the whole building was tumbling into the street. Then his body was thrown over the side of the rooftop. He closed his eyes, sure that this was the end, and fell for what seemed like minutes until he slammed into the tile floor of the terrace beneath. He was rolled to his left and got wedged against the railings of the terrace, his arms tangled in the wrought iron and his head dangling over the edge. As he opened his eyes, he saw the white circumcision bed come through the open window below, and on that white bed was his son. Ismail lay on his back with his arms thrown behind him like he was doing the backstroke. Their eyes briefly met. Ismail had a questioning look on his face. He didn't seem scared at all, just a question mark in his eyes as if to say, "Look, what a strange thing to happen, Baba." In his white circumcision dress, Ismail floated out above the crumbling building, as if on a pillow of air. Sinan reached a hand out toward his son, stretching his fingers as far as he could. Cement blocks tumbled beneath the boy, crashed together, crushed and disintegrated, and the bed too spun around in the air. Ismail did a somersault, his tiny feet rolling above his head, his back coming briefly into view, his whole body flipping gracefully through the sky before it disappeared in the dust and crumble below. So if you haven't read the book and you want to find out what happened to Ismail, then you're going to have to read it. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Read a fairly short scene. I was very excited. Soon after the book sold here in the States, the book sold to a publisher in Turkey. I was really excited about it because the whole time I was writing this book, I thought, I'm a white guy from Southern California. What business do I have writing about a Kurdish man from the southeast of Turkey? And for whatever reason, I couldn't stop thinking about these characters, and I finally decided to write the book anyway. And I thought I was very nervous that I was going to get a lot of things wrong in this book. And so without my publisher, with the agent trying to sell the book, somebody from Kurdish in Turkey just showed up at a Vienna book fair and asked to buy the book. And so when I heard this, I was very excited. I thought, all right, I didn't do too bad. I got things right. So about a year later, I was heading to Istanbul to do a little research for this thing over here. And I got a plane, flew over there, landed, got to my hotel around 10:30 at night, and called my wife, Mimi. And she says, have you spoken to Dorian? Dorian's my agent. I said, no, I just got here. Well, you need to speak to her. But let me tell you what's going on. And then she told me that apparently, I think this is coincidental. Apparently, while I was flying to Istanbul, before this, I had sent emails to my editor and said, I'm coming into town. He said, great, let's go out to dinner. And strangely enough, interestingly enough, he had an Armenian name. So we had plans for the publisher was going to take me out to dinner. So I got there. My hotel's probably 3 blocks down from the publishing house. So she tells me, well, apparently the board members of Kurdish, which is owned by İş Bankası, which was a bank that's founded by Ataturk himself, got together that day and said, we can't publish this book. And they thought it might be anti-Turkish, since I'm writing from a Kurdish point of view. So I was upset at first. Then I felt a little like I had offended a friend, and then I was kind of proud of the fact that it didn't. Sometimes I thought maybe I was just getting something right. So a few years later, strangely enough, there was a woman, she was a Canadian woman, a former professor, retired in Naples, Florida, and she'd chosen Gardens of Water she was choosing it for a reading series, and then she was going to choose some books for a lecture series. And there was some booksellers that were really interested and really loved the book, and were really trying to convince her to put it on the lecture series because, well, if they did, it would sell a lot of books and be good for everybody. And they had lunch with her, and apparently she said, I love Gardens of Water, but I don't feel comfortable talking about this book with this audience. I think they'll see it as being anti-American. All right. So about 3 weeks ago, and I've had a few of these, I got an email from obviously a very devout Christian man. I was upset with my portrayal of Christians in the story, and he was claiming it was anti-Christian. So apparently this is anti-everything. And I really didn't mean that, but I think that maybe this is the scene that might be part of this. And this is happening 9 days after the earthquake, and Sin and his family have been sleeping next to off-ramp of a freeway, because it's one of the only places where things wouldn't fall on you. And there were a bunch of, after the earthquake, there were a bunch of aftershocks. And so they've been sitting there just eating basically apples, rotten apples, for 9 days, because it was very difficult to get relief supplies into town. And what's happened is this convoy of white vans come in there. It's an American relief organization. And Marcus Roberts, this man who lives above him, is heading up the organization. So, oh, and just before this, a shepherd has brought in brought down some goats, some sheep, and had offered one to Sinan to slaughter, so they might have some meat. The trucks drove out of sight, and Sinan followed the sound of their engines until they turned the corner toward an empty field that used to be the recreation grounds of the old Ottoman prison. Watching the back of the buses throwing up dust from the road, Sinan was reminded of the jeeps the Turkish paramilitaries had driven through the center of Yeşilli. Once he watched a driver speed up to run over a chicken, Emre Bey's family's only rooster, the breast of the bird popping open like a crushed melon. Another time, 3 jeeps parked in the center of the village on market day, keeping the produce sellers from setting up their tables. The jeeps were built in America, his father had said. In the South, everyone knew that America supported the Turkish paramilitary, the special teams as they were called, giving them training and weapons and shelter from the UN while they destroyed whole villages in search of Öcalan and the PKK. All the Turks knew this, all the UN knew this, but it was kept quiet as if it didn't happen. Because America wants to spy on Russia, his father told him once, we get murdered. Now the Americans were here to help. It was confusing what to believe about America. Using twine from the tomato vines, Sinan hung the ewe from a nearby tree, gutted it, and let it bleed. He sat on his haunches and watched the blood drip and soak into the ground. He was so sick of death. There were people in the world that never had to face death, except in old age, when death is almost comforting. But they never had to face the violence of a young death. They never had to bury their father with tissue paper stuffed and sewn into his collapsed skull. They were mean, stupid people, he imagined, sitting in their homes in America or England, staring vacantly at their televisions, falling asleep in a bored stupor on their couches. He hated and wanted to be one of those vacant people. Yesterday at the ice skating rink, he'd identified the bodies of Ahmet and his family. Their faces had been calm, their bodies bloodless, but he could see where their ribs had been broken, where their chests lay as flat as their stomachs. Overwhelmed, he had embraced Ahmet before they wrapped his brother-in-law's body in a bag, tied it together at his ankles and shoulders, and carried him away. Because officials were afraid of the spread of disease, all the dead, including Ahmet and his family, were tossed into a common grave. The mayor was there, standing at the edge of the open pit, alternately trying to comfort family members who were praying over the burlap bags and loudly criticizing the government. I'm sorry, he said, pressing a handkerchief to his nose. I'm sorry, but we must bury them now. He poured lemon cologne over his already soaked handkerchief and pressed it again to his nose. Where's the government? Where's the Red Crescent? Touching a mourner's shoulder, he said, I'm so sorry, but we must do this. Before the mourners' prayers were finished, bulldozers covered the bags with earth, and still people remained, speaking to the bumps and curves of the torn-up ground. For a moment now, staring at the swollen flap of the sheep's distended tongue, Sinan imagined death as a one-way mirror. Like the glass, it was said the special teams unit sat behind while watching the interrogations and torture of suspected PKK rebels. Some men, the ones who survived and came back to Yeşilli to tell their story, said it was the being watched, the knowledge that men drank tea just on the other side of the glass while they were being beaten, that made the torture so unbearable. Most of the men who were tortured didn't even care about a Kurdistan. They simply wanted to live their lives, speak their language instead of Turkish, farm their fields, tend to their sheep, feed their families. Once you were behind that glass, though, Kurdistan Workers' Party or not, separatist or Turkish nationalist, you might as well have been dead, because your body no longer belonged to you. It belonged to the brutality or mercy of a man, and that man belonged to the Turkish state, and his fists were the fists of the Turkish Republic, and his boot was the boot of the Turkish Republic, and the electricity that convulsed your body was provided by the Turkish Republic, and the blood that was spilled, even if it was Kurdish blood, was the color of the Turkish Republic's flag. It seemed to Sinan that the living and the dead were separated by a thin membrane through which the living could not see, a membrane punctured only briefly at the moment of death, and he wondered if Ahmet, Gulfem, and Zeynep stood just on the other side now, so close but out of sight and out of reach. He wondered if Sarah Hanum stood there too, looking in and regretting her sacrifice. His father even, although he'd been dead all his years. He imagined that if he looked closely enough at the dead sheep, he would see some reflection of death, some living element in it, but all he saw was an eye, black and empty, and pooled blood as useless as spilled water. By the time the animal was ready, the shepherd and his flock were gone, where to Sinan did not know. It struck Sinan that God had sent the shepherd, and if he sent the shepherd, then perhaps he had sent the Americans as well. He felt a sudden jolt of hope that this was some part of some plan, some reminder from him not to get too attached to this brief time on earth, because to be with God is the greatest, the only real existence. And that's how the dead finally won over all living people, torturer or loving family member. No matter who you were, no matter how helpless and weak and helpless, once you were dead, you knew what it meant to be with God, and the living did not know, and the not knowing haunted the living, and the haunting was the doubt that God existed at all. He skinned the animal, untied the twine, and slung the carcass over his shoulders. There was still a little blood coming from the gash, and it trickled warm across his shoulders and chest. It was an unclean thing to carry an animal in such a way, and the burden of it made him a little sick to his stomach. He had never liked killing. It always made him brood with guilt. Two of the other men waited near the animal and smoked. Sinan nodded to them as he passed, and they nodded back. "May it go easily," Sinan said. "For you too," the older of the two men replied. How are we doing on time? I have no clue how we're doing on time. Yeah, time for... So we have time to do one from here, you think? All right. And then you can ask me anything you want. All right, I said I would not write another book that takes place in Turkey. And here I am writing another book that takes place in Turkey. The story's different, though. Well, it plays in some ideas, some political ideas, but this the story is called The Hidden Life, and I'm in the middle of a pretty serious revision. It takes place in 2007, the fall of 2007, at a really important point in modern contemporary Turkish history. At the time, the Justice and Development Party, which is a, quote, Islamist leaning party, had come to power in Turkey. And if you don't know anything about Turkey, there's a real strict separation of church and state in Turkey, or separation of mosque and state. And for a long time, the secularists have been really in charge of the country. And what they've done is sort of kept the power for themselves and sort of very nepotistically, and have really helped the cities out, but haven't helped the villagers, the people that tend to be a little more conservative. But as all those villagers have been pushed into the city, they've sort of gotten their voice, political voice, and started voting more. And in 2007, they voted in this Islamic-leaning party, and for the first time in modern Turkey's history, the president and the prime minister of the country have wives that wear headscarves. And so suddenly, the headscarves have become a very big issue in Turkey. It's sort of a symbolic issue. And at the head of this, sort of the thing that's sort of the flashpoint of this is that many Turkish university students who are covered, the law has always said you have to take off your headscarves when you go to university. You have to. So if you're a devout Muslim, before you walk in, you got to take them off, put them away to go into your classes. And so what's happened is that these women start protesting, and they started getting a lot of political power. And in 2007, AKP, which is the name of the party, overturned the ban when they won parliament, and the secularists are really upset. They think that means Sharia law is going to take over. So I'm writing the story from the point of view of these three women, covered women, that are involved in this battle. But I'm only going to read about one woman, and I'm going to try to get something that doesn't look like I'm so depressed, and read something that's a little more light. This is Layla, and she is sort of an interesting woman because she was raised in a wealthy secular family. She does not have to wear a headscarf. Nobody's forced her to do it. And she, as she got older, decided to adopt a headscarf because she feels a sort of spiritual emptiness. Yet she also wants to write her own rules about the kind of life she lives, even though she wants to show that she believes in God. And one of the things she's doing right now is she's involved in a relationship with a man, an American professor who's teaching at a university. And this is sort of dealing with this. When it opens up, she's just left David. They've had an argument after a protest. his job has been threatened, and Fatima, another woman in the story, has discovered their relationship, and they've argued, and she's gone home in her anger, but he keeps calling her. She first met him in his English course, Shakespeare, Brawling Love and Loving Hate. She and Fatima and Chisem and another woman, Zainab, had taken the course together. He wasn't an amazing teacher, but he clearly loved Shakespeare, even though he often had to teach the works in a modern translation from the Elizabethan English to break through the second language barrier. When Hands Off My Headscarves, is the name of the organization, decided to test the resolve of the university, chose his class first. Having gone to a private school with many young, idealistic American expat teachers, she knew they tended to view the repression of just about anything by an institution as a violation of human rights. Because of this, students got away with all manners of things in class, iPod earphones pressed into one ear, as long as you can hear me with the other ear, one of our high school English teachers had said. Skirts hiked up to show the upper thigh, piercings to the nose, discussions of the Armenian question, and any number of rule breakings, as long as it seemed to be under the guise of individual freedom. The first time they walked into his class, the very first day of the semester, David turned his head and seemed to want to say something, but then he went on with his lecture, stopping only once to quell the whispers of angry students in the back who didn't like the imposition of Islam on their learning. Their brains seemed to stop when they saw cloth on a woman's head. They didn't seem to notice that Professor Hamill's lecture about sex and love and suicide was not interrupted once by Islam or its believers. The second time they came into class wearing their scarves, he set down his notes and asked them to come out into the hallway with him. "Please," he said, "it doesn't matter to me if you wear your scarves. Personally, I think you should be allowed, but as a member of this faculty, I have to ask you to take them off." "No," Fatima said. "It's my right." "Please," he said, with such sincerity it was difficult not to feel for him. "The law says otherwise. You're making things difficult for me." Gisem took her scarf off immediately, along with Zainab. Layla hesitated. She didn't like to be seen as the first person to cave in. Fatima refused, though. "Is this the kind of democratic values you Americans like to teach to the world?" Layla smiled at that, especially since she could see David squirm at the accusation. It was unfair of her, though, and Layla felt sorry for the man. Then Layla had followed Fatima out into the courtyard, and they stood there together, the place empty, everyone else in class, the windows of all the classrooms darkened with reflective tinting. She told Fatima she was going back in. "Whatever you want," her friend said, without hiding her disdain. "Are you going to drop the class?" Layla said. Fatima turned on one foot and looked away toward the gate that led into the square. "I don't know, Layla." "Go ahead," Layla said. "Give them what they want." "I don't care what they want." And Layla left Fatima standing there alone in the courtyard, stripping off her scarf as she walked back into the building, letting her hair fall over her shoulders. With Fatima it was all or nothing, no tact, no strategy. The woman simply didn't like to lose. When she opened the classroom door, David's back was turned to her. He was drawing arrows between characters' names. The room smelled of whiteboard pen. The women in the back, the ones who had interrupted class last week, whispered to each other. She smiled at them, feeling smug about her beauty. She knew she had this thing called beauty, could feel it in the length of her neck, in the sway of her hips, in the confidence she had in the thoughts in her head, and she clicked her heels across the floor, not even trying to hide her entrance now, her long strides like little slaps across their faces. She sat, and David had turned around by then, watching her. He paused for just a moment, not long, but mid-sentence, his mouth hung open for a semicolon of a pause. His eyes took in her whole face, her blonde hair, which she knew he hadn't expected, her dirty blue eyes, the stare she offered back to him as if to say, "Now look what you've got to deal with." With red pen in hand, he recovered by scratching his sideburn, which left a small pen slash against his cheek. "What?" he said, when a few people laughed out loud. She learned later that he had a sense of humor, but it didn't seem so then, and because of this, no one in class told him about the red pen gash across his cheek, and the class went on without interruption. She couldn't say what he lectured about in that session, though she took notes, but she watched him when he looked up from his notes, his eyes glancing at her first before he remembered the rest of the room and consciously turned his head to speak to them too. When the class was over, she took out a tissue from her purse and poured a little water from the bottle she kept there onto the folded square. "Here," she said, placing the wet tissue on the lectern in front of him. She pointed to her cheek. "Right here." He was confused for a moment, then he rubbed his finger there as though he could feel it like a wound. He broke out laughing. "That's why," he said. She turned to walk out of the classroom, glancing back once to the doorway to find him watching her and wiping the wet paper across his cheekbone. And so he keeps calling her and texting her and trying to get her to come back over to his place, and she's frustrated and doesn't want to go back. And what usually happens is he calls her and they end up going out late, and that's where I'm going to open up here. And it turns out they're being watched by people, secret agents are watching them, the MIT, and so they're nervous about that as well. Excuse me. If she responded, he would text again, and she would respond again, each trying to outdo each other with silly wit. And then he'd call, and she'd answer, and they'd be up for hours, or he'd get sick of hearing her voice through the stale satellite connection and convince her to meet her for a late-night tea at an obscure tea house, or at a hotel bar where only tourists drank, so she could watch him sip his wine and listen to him offer ever more ridiculous and slightly ironic the kind of irony and intellectual demands to temper discomfort with sincerity, compliments. Your eyes are the color of a storm-churned Aegean, he said the last time they were out. Foam gray, she responded to that one. Wry smile, a sip of wine. You're the most beautiful covered woman in the Levant, her. But uncovered, him, passively pretty. A glance from the bartender, just a glance, and in perfect English she asked for a club soda. Let him think I'm American. Americans always do things their own way. 2 glasses of red later. You're my Juliet, he said. Ugh. Too obvious? A tip of the head. He was lonely, she knew that, and his loneliness made him dangerous. He didn't know he was dangerous, but all needy men were, and the lonely ones were the most dangerous. Isolde, I won't die of a broken heart. My Francesca. If I have to read about Lancelot and Guinevere, I'll vomit. Eloise, you're my Eloise. You're a monk now, are you? A smile and a moment to think. Marie, you're my Marie. A blank. You got me. He always did. And then he explained, sitting up a little, assuming a professorial tone. Marie Curie, a Polish chemist who wasn't allowed to attend university in her homeland and escaped to the Sorbonne. She met Pierre there, and they married, and they discovered polonium and radium. Romantic. She ignored the various implications in the story. They won the Nobel. Well, good for them. He died. They always do. And now she couldn't sleep, so she made a cup of tea and sat in the dark on her couch, watching the people on the street below stumble down the stairs past Galata. A group of young men swung each other down the hill, singing the Galatasaray fight song. One of them stopped to throw up, his hands splayed on the shuttered front door of the guitar store, splashing at his feet. A man moved in the shadows next to the sick boy, dressed in a dark suit. She only saw him because he took one step sideways to keep the vomit from landing on his shoes. He then faded back into the stone facade of an old bank building. Now that he had moved, though, she could see him clearly. The darker form against the gray of the weathered colonnade, a long coat, a sliver of light on leather shoes. She didn't think he could see her, if he was, in fact, someone looking for her. But then she noticed a glint of streetlight against the rim of her tea glass, and she set it down on the table next to the couch and sat there holding her breath in the dark. Her phone vibrated and she jumped, coupling the display in her hand, hoping to deflect some of the light away from the window. She read a text. I know you can't sleep. You're sitting in the dark thinking of me. She hopped over to the bed, got under the covers, and texted back. Someone's on the street watching my window. He didn't respond immediately, and she sat in the middle of the bed, listening to the fading echo of the boys singing the fight song, hearing the scrape of feet on the street or the shuffling of cats and garbage, and she kept an ear leaning towards her door, listening for the pressure of steps in the corridor stairs. She was on the 3rd floor. There was nowhere to go should someone be standing out there waiting. I know, he wrote back finally. You're hiding in bed now. She tiptoed over to the window and looked out. The man leaning against the colonnade was gone, the street light catching the carved torso of a Greek-like goddess. She looked as though she'd been hung up there on a meat hook. Out of the corner of her eye, a half block down the street from the bank, she caught the glow of a cigarette ember. It was David, sitting on the stoop of an apartment, blowing smoke above his head. He was typing into his phone with his left hand. By yonder blessed moon, I swear. Allah, Allah, she whispered to the window. Stop there. It sounds a lot different out loud than it does when you're reading your head. My wife hasn't even seen that, so she's usually the last line of defense, or the first line of defense, whichever it is. I think I read too long, but if you guys, any questions, anything you want to ask me? Maybe it's a good thing I read. Yes.
What are the challenges, or could you talk just a minute about the challenges that you're finding now of writing from the perspective of these women? And are the chapters, how is the novel broken? Is it coming from, are chapters dedicated to each of the women, or how are you?
Kind of. I mean, I'm still trying to figure that out. Layla and Fatima come in contact a lot because they're sort of working. They're both involved in this battle. There's other character, Melike, who is not a university student. Actually, she's a married woman, and she's sort of this woman sort of inspired by the protests. And she has an abusive husband, and she ends up leaving the house to go to these protests until she gets beaten up, and her husband discovers what she's doing. Melike knows Fatima, and Fatima sort of tries to convince her to leave her husband. So there's these intersection points that sort of they sort of intersect often with these different protests as they get near the vote to overturn the headscarf ban. So I've got it right now. I've got sort of separate sections. I might have chapter 6 Fatima, and then chapter 8 Melike, and then I have sections where there's an overlap, and say 2 of them might be in the same scenes together and has a different title. I don't have the titles memorized. So it's I haven't done something like this before, where you try to intersect these 3 stories, so it's a little bit of a challenge. But right now what I'm doing is sort of getting, I've spent the last 3 weeks writing from Layla's point of view. That's why I read from her, just because my head's in her point of view right now, and rather than switch back and forth, I'm just sort of writing it out, and then I'll sort of piece it together later on, I think, which will certainly change things, but that's sort of how I'm attacking it now. As far as writing from their point of view, I don't know, I tried to write from an American man's point of view in the story, and I had a really difficult time. I don't know why. I wasn't interested. I didn't really care about the guy, and I kept trying to write it. And then I wrote 250 pages of this guy, and went up to New York, met with the editor, and she said, "Well, let's talk about this guy." It's the other, she's like, "Fatima's session's working really well. Maybe you should rethink this character." And so it was torture. I'm glad she said it though, because now I sort of pulled out these other minor characters in the story, started writing from their points of view, and for whatever reason, I'm intrigued by them, and for whatever reason, it seems to be working. Whether or not a covered Turkish woman will read it and think that I got it right or not, I don't know. But I do have some friends that I still know in Turkey that I will bounce. I'll have them read it and bounce it off of them. So it's kind of the same thing that I did with the last book, and it's just really, again, sitting down and trying not to be me. I'm pretty bored with myself anyway, so the idea of just sitting down and trying to imagine somebody else's point of view is nice. It's nice to get away from yourself a little bit. But I don't understand. I don't understand why I want to write about this. I can't answer that question. All I know is that I'm intrigued by what these people are doing. I'm intrigued by the questions that I think it brings up, and I want to write about it. Yes, me again.
You teach snow sometimes too, right?
I do.
And the headscarf debate comes up in that one for a while.
Right.
And I admit, when I read that book, I got to that part and I felt as if it was a little bit of a political,
Right.
I was like, oh, here we were going.
Right.
How do you avoid that sense of the reader thinking of a political agenda that's overriding the characters' voices that you just read to us were so amazing? The vibrancy of that versus, or do you not care?
Right.
Is my idea that there's this political drive.
I always write too much of the politics, and then it ends up being stripped out a lot. Just because it starts sounding too much like idea, and it's like the characters start to be just there to serve the idea of the story. And I think Pamuk's wonderful, and I think there's some amazing things about Snow, but that book bothers me for the same reasons. He calls it his political book, but it's so political in some ways. I don't feel like there's a certain distance from the characters I don't like. I kind of feel like they seem like they're playing parts for the political argument he wants to make at times, except maybe for Ka. So the way I'm trying to do is just that this, the battle sets up the political backdrop to this, and it's the thing that makes things dangerous for them, that pushes, it pushes the things that are happening with their families, for instance. Like Fatima is on a half, this one character is on a half scholarship at university, and she's being threatened because to have her scholarship taken away if she's involved in these protests, and at the same time her father, who is she's lower middle class, her father is trying to set her up with people for marriage, and she loses her scholarship, and so it suddenly puts this pressure on her because her father's older and because her father's in ill health, that she sort of get torn between what she sort of this freedom she wants, and then the duty to her father. And so I'm like trying to, as the story moves on, trying to move away from the political argument more into how that is exacerbating things that are happening within the relationships of these different characters that way. So that's the hope anyway. Yeah.
Have you visited Turkey recently, or are you working from memory, or have you interviewed like characters for research?
I mean, I'm reading books all the time, and I read the Turkish newspapers pretty regularly. This last one I was there was probably a year and a half ago, I think, and it was a short trip, unfortunately. So I need to go back, and I'm hoping to go back this summer. This is when I'm finishing up this book, hopefully finishing up this book. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's, when I said I wouldn't write another Turkish book, part of the reason why is I wasn't living there anymore, and my memory of the place was getting, sort of distant. In some ways, that might be kind of good, because in the first book, I put too much stuff in. Because I had this great memory of the place. I had to put everything in. I had to put in I had to put in the fluted tea glass. I had to put in the punch tin table. I had to put in all this stuff, and it just got cluttered. So in some ways, it's the things that are stuck in my head, are sort of essential. But I need to get back. I talk with friends all the time that still live there. I talk to former students, so I try to keep my head in as much as possible. But I do need to go because I feel like my memory is fading pretty quickly. And now I'm missing again. Now that I've gotten writing about these characters, I kind of hated this book until I got rid of the American character. And I was like, wow, this is great. It's gone. And now I'm writing about these women. I'm really intrigued. I'm really excited to, my head's back into place, and I'm really excited to go back and talk to people. So, yes, no.
Is there anything that's easier about writing the second book than writing your first book?
No. Nothing. Unfortunately. I never believed authors when they would say, I remember it was Ethan Kane's workshop, and we were talking about second books. And he's like, a second book is the worst. It's the worst book you'll ever write. And, we're all like, we're just writing stories, and some of us hadn't even started writing a novel yet. And I'm like, shut up, Ethan. No, you're lying to us. You're just being a drama king, And it turns out to be true. All these people that tell me that, the second novel is the hardest one. I think it's been difficult for me, just because I started writing it when I was still going out talking about Gardens of Water, when I was still doing revisions for Gardens of Water, Random House. So it's like trying to separate your mind from one book to the other one was difficult. But now that it took me a long time to find the sort of the emotional center of the book, and now that I think I've found it, it feels a lot easier. But it really was, about getting rid of that character. Like I tell you guys, one character's not working, get rid of him, But it's painful, but it's good now. Yes.
You have, of course, since Gardens of Water's been out for a while, you have all these examples of how people have responded to it. And the ones that you gave us so far were pretty political, like the ways that people respond politically. It's anti-American or it's anti-Turkish. But it seems like also what you describe in your second book is about being connected to the characters emotionally. And you have, because you're compelled by these political questions, but you're also writing a book that has an emotional impact. I just was interested in how you felt, like from Gardens of Water. You've heard a lot of different people respond to it now, a lot. Your emails,
right.
You've got to see people in person. And how do you think most people responded to Gardens of Water?
I think most people tell me that they especially love Sinan, that they really feel for him, and they're surprised that they do. Because I get told I'm told that he's a very complicated character, and I try to make him very complicated. He does things that upset you and you don't like, but he also hopefully try to give a perspective, and so you understand where he's coming from a little bit. So a lot of people have responded in that way, and were impressed by that character, I guess. I get a lot of really positive responses. That's the easiest way I can say it, I guess.
But are they more emotional or political?
More emotional.
But of course, to have an emotional response to that character is also have a political one.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was doing a book club actually in Radnor, and I was sitting there, and there was all these people sitting in front of me, and they were all smiles and happy, and they seemed to be enjoying the reading. And there was this woman to my right. I could see her the whole time, and she was like this the whole time we were talking. She just never moved like this, and she waited to the very end, till there was no other hands, and then she put her hand up finally. It was the first time she moved her body, and she said, "I want to know, do you love your country?" I was sort of shocked by it, and she's like, "Because when I get to the end of this book, I really think you hate your country." And my impression was that she thought that, there's some things in the story that some political things in the story that are part of me, but I'm writing from Sinan Bashiolu's point of view. This person has had this experience, and as much as possible trying to see the world through his eyes, and I believe he would see the world this way. And she was sort of misreading the book, I think. She was reading it more as if, she was reading more like it was nonfiction. She wasn't thinking about the fact that you're immersed in somebody's point of view, and that point of view is something separate from the writers in some ways. And so I think a lot of people get angry about it, sort of see it that way. So I go out and talk to people, they don't want to talk about, oftentimes they don't want to talk about the book, they want to talk about, oh, you were there in Turkey when the earthquake hit. What was it like? Were Turks nice? That kind of thing. And people, for some reason, people want nonfiction more than they want fiction for some reason. I don't know. But sometimes I think there's a misunderstanding of how to read fiction, and that comes from that. Just my impression at times. I'm probably not answering your question at all, am I? But I do get a lot of response. I mean, and at REM too, people always want to know, they think I'm weird because they want to know how I could write from a 15-year-old girl's point of view. So it's especially weird when you go and I talked to a couple high school groups that have read the book, and like 15-year-old girls are yelling at me, mad at me about what happens to a REM. But then other people are just, they want to know how I can do that. I'm like, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that question. I just sit down and try to imagine being these people, as much as possible, and talking to Mimi, of course. Yeah, Jeremy.
Like your novel, your second novel, Modern Turkey's a work in progress too, politically.
Right.
And you've been talked about being confronted on all sides, as a Yankee, as a non-Yankee, et cetera. How does that shape your development of the characters? You must be at least sensitive at this point to political outrage, no matter what the group being outraged.
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't come to terms with those questions, and it's one of the reasons why I kind of almost didn't want to get back into this stuff again, because I was just in Iowa, and there was a Turkish man there that wanted to make sure at the end that he wanted me to talk about Turkey in general, in terms of like, how did you like it there? He wanted to make sure that I said nice things about Turkey afterwards. So it's kind of weird to be the focus of that attention. I really don't know. I think that what I try to do is, I guess part of the thing I'm trying to get out with a lot of these stories is that there's this political context, and everybody seems to view each other through the prisms of politics, and everybody has a difficult time sort of seeing the individual behind it and the individual motivations. So as much as I can, I'm trying to move away from the politics and get into the individual behind these very stereotypical ways we view each other. I'm not answering your question at all. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know how to get away from the politics. And I'm intrigued by the political questions there, and people sometimes get frustrated with me because I'm an American, and of course I have a certain, no matter what, I can't get away from who I am. I see the world in a certain way, but I really try to show the complicated sides of all these people, and the complicated sides of all the questions, at least as I see it. And for me also, like, I've had people tell me I shouldn't write these stories. I have no right to write these stories. But I don't hear people telling nonfiction writers who are going out and and interviewing people that they don't have a right to come back and present some semblance of the truth about that. That I'm writing fiction, I'm lying in a way that I'm trying to get at a greater truth. I'm trying to lie in a sensitive way, but I'm trying to get back to these characters. So this man that the man that wrote to me about the Christians, I said, well, I was there, I lived in Turkey. He wrote all these great things about how I got the culture right, and then he's lived there for 10 years, and he said, well, but I worked with some Christians in an organization after the earthquake, and I can't imagine those people would ever do that, would ever do what the Christians do in this thing. Well, I'm not writing about those people you knew. I'm writing about the people I created. And I'm writing about people I created in a situation that grows out of a real situation that actually saw these people proselytizing. So I'm taking that so that does happen, and then the rest of it's fiction. It's the same thing where he said, I knew Kurdish men. I lived in Diyarbakir, and I can't imagine any Kurdish men I know doing this. Well, I know Kurdish men as well, and they were wonderful people, and I can't imagine them doing these things either, acting like Sinan does either. But I'm writing about Sinan Bashiolu, this man I created, who has had this experience that grows out of I've read all these books on these terrible experiences that people went through in the southeast of Turkey. And they're trying to take that situation and imagine an individual person who was a man first, who's experienced these things, and perhaps a Kurdish man second, and try to get down to the bare bones of being a human being, and sitting down with Sinan, if I had lost my father in a raid like Sinan has, how would I feel about it? How would I react to this American man who shows up suddenly and wants to help me? You know? I think I might be mad. So it's just always trying to get back to a personal level, I guess. And if, you know, people can deal with the political stuff, I guess, and tell me what a jerk I am if they want to. You know? Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the relationship of the three women who put on the headscarves and ask you if there was an emotional core to that. Maybe 3 students you had, or a friendship that your wife had, or, you know, what was the emotional core of that started that? Was it an image?
Yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, all these things grow out of experience I had when I was there. And so, for instance, I was working at a private school with very wealthy secular students, and I think this is 2002 probably. There was a sophomore girl who was coming from a very conservative family, and we think her family put her up to it. We're not sure, but I was working there's a front gate, and in Turkey they have these little, they're called dolmuşes, these white buses that bring everybody to school. And so I was working the gate, and there's a security guard right there, and this girl tried to walk from the gate with a headscarf on. And she actually, I was standing there like, oh my God, this shouldn't happen. And the security guy was talking to somebody else, he didn't see her, and she actually got through the gate. I didn't know quite what to do. And he stopped her, and he grabbed her, which is not something you're supposed to do. He grabbed her and walked her back out through the gate and wouldn't let her back in until she took her scarf off. And so she had to stand there and take it off and fold it into her backpack. And all the other students were walking by were just leering at her and clicking their tongues at her and just really, really disdainful to her. And she tried that 2 or 3 more times until they called the parents in and said, "Look, your kid's gonna get kicked out if she doesn't stop doing this." And so she did, and she stayed. But it was for weeks and weeks after that, people were just terrible to her. I mean, she sat by herself. People walked by, and people on campus, other teachers, Turkish teachers, allowed that to happen. They wanted her to be ostracized for that. Because in Turkey, it's the idea is that, well, that means Sharia law is going to take over. We're going to become Iran and Saudi Arabia or whatever. So I was thinking about that girl, and then she seemed to do fine. Then she seemed to be able to come to school, and she didn't seem to have a problem. But who knows what was going on inside of her doing that? And who knows if her parents were really pushing her to do that or not? And then I met Layla. I was sort of inspired by a former student of mine who was the kind of girl that you always had to ask her to take her piercings off when she came to campus. And she was big into acting, and she showed up drunk one day to a performance. She was a brilliant student. She ended up a really brilliant kid. She was dating all these American boys that were diplomats' sons, and so she's very hip, very into art. And she went to the University of Chicago, got her bachelor's degree there, and she was, when I met her in New York, she was going to NYU to get her master's degree. And I went to have dinner with her just to catch up. We went to this Mexican restaurant. She started drinking a margarita. And then she went in this diatribe about Ataturk. She's just like, Ataturk took my religion away. He took my language away. And I couldn't believe what she's saying. And she seemed the exact opposite of the kind. I mean, she seemed the epitome of like the Western-leaning secular girl. And she was so upset. It's like she went to the University of Chicago, and for the first time she read Ottoman. She went to the University of Chicago, and the first time she really heard about, really got an insight into her religion, what she says a religion. I mean, most secular Turks still identify themselves as as Muslims, sort of like a lot of Americans identify themselves as Christians but don't really go to church. And she was so upset, yet she ordered another margarita, and she kept drinking. He took my religion away, and she's throwing back margaritas, So it's just such a weird thing. And I thought, wow, this is something really, really important is happening with her. She's really trying to understand something that isn't about an extreme, the sort of extremist, secularist democracy, well, not quite a democracy, and then the extreme, religious viewpoint. And then she's really trying to negotiate this middle ground in a place that doesn't really want her to negotiate that middle ground. So when I started thinking about Layla, I keep thinking about Zainab. And then, then it's just me sitting down and trying to imagine within that context, how does she negotiate this world for herself? And I think that happens. I think we tend to see these things, especially from a distance, as Muslim people are this way, and I think Turks are Muslim people are the same way. Americans are like this, or Christians are like this, and I think there's in some ways here we tend to view Muslims at a distance like fundamentalists, maybe not in the university, but like in the general world. Or there's just really, really nice people that are just amazingly religious and don't ever have a bad thought in their life, you know. And, you know, of course they do. They're like anybody else, you know. So yeah, those two people in particular.
Yeah. We're talking about working with your characters and seeing things from the character's point of view. I just wondered how that process affects your understanding or your attitude or whatever about your topic. You know what I mean? Does the process of working through all that change you or change your understanding of your topic?
Yeah, it does. I'm not quite sure if I can have an anecdote to say how. I mean, it's a combination of writing from these characters' points of view, but then I'm also doing research at the same time to do it. So I start reading about things I would not have otherwise seen or known, and start hearing, you know, finding out some of the things that happened that are disturbing to me, at least politically speaking. Yeah, I mean, with Sinan, you know, I had to write from the point of view of a man who thinks about killing his daughter, you know, which I couldn't imagine doing. And not only that, I had to do it in a way that was not judgmental. I had to try to understand the reasons why he might think about doing this. Like, what is, you know, theologically, philosophically, emotionally, what are the things that are moving him towards thinking about doing this while he loves his daughter? You know, how can somebody do that? And so to write him, I had to imagine being able to do that and being able to think the way he was thinking. Does it change the way I view honor killings? No, I mean, not at all. But at least I feel like maybe, just after all the reading I've done, and then just trying to write from this person's point of view and being there, and I think maybe I understand some of the reasons why it happens that aren't just because men are jerks and they like to have control over their kids. I think there's a deeper philosophical thing going on at times. Not always, but at times, at least for Sinan. So yeah, it's a weird place to be, you know, because I can't stand him when he's doing that, but then I'm writing it when he's thinking about doing it. So it's kind of unsettling. You know?
Is your next book in your head?
Is it in my head, the next one after this one?
Yeah. Or is it sort of coming out? Is it starting to bother you?
I have an idea that I'm interested in. It does not take place in Turkey. I'm actually going to go back to California for it. And I almost put this book aside when I was having problems with it and thought I would start that book, but I've put like 2.5 years, 3 years into this, and now it's become interesting to me again. So yeah, there's an idea there, but I'm trying not to think about it. I'm trying to keep my head in this one, you know, since there's so little time to do that anyway. But it's in California. It actually has, I think it's going to focus around the Richard Ramirez killings in Southern California. I don't know if you know about that, the Night Stalker. I grew up in Irvine. I don't know if anybody knows Irvine in Southern California. It's a master plan, perfect community. Everything's perfect there. Don't worry, nothing bad happens in Irvine. But when I was growing up there, it was all orange groves and olive trees, and it was like this. I don't know. It was like this Mediterranean Eden kind of in a way, you know. And there was like 2 housing tracts, and I happened to live in one of those. But as I was growing up, it completely changed, and they just sort of destroyed everything to build these just one after another housing tracts, and you know, if even Irvine at the time, you would hear about all these things, horrible things are happening in L.A., and then you hear all these things horrible things are happening in North Orange County, and you hear all of these things, horrible things happening in Santa Ana. You know, as the years went by, and it all kind of got closer and closer, and everybody in Irvine would be like blissfully like, "Whoa, you know, I got 16-inch rims on my BMW. We get to go on the beach on Saturdays." It was like this, and everything's perfect still, you know. But then all these really dark things that happen underneath the perfection of this place. And I remember there was this one night, Richard Ramirez had been working down from LA, and he'd killed somebody in Fullerton, which was the first one in Orange County. And then everybody's like, "Oh, you know, it's no big deal. It's still Fullerton. You know, Fullerton's another world." And then there's 2 freeways that run through, the 5 and the 405, and everyone went to bed that night. The next morning woke up, and he had killed somebody in Mission Viejo that night. So we woke up to find out that it happened. Which when he drove, we lived 1.5 miles from the freeway, and his thing was to hit houses within 2 miles of the freeway. It means he drove from Fullerton right past everybody's house to Mission Viejo, and suddenly everybody was freaking out. Everybody everybody just lost it. It was like, it seemed like this sort of time and when this, whatever innocence existed there sort of died. So sort of thinking about that. It used to be like vaqueros, it'd be like cowboys in Irvine. It was cool. I liked it. I miss it. Miss that. So it's kind of want to write about the sort of death of this thing with this other thing happening. I don't know what form that's going to take in terms of characters, but I'm interested in it.
Used to live in the Lancaster Palm Bay.
Yeah. So you remember that?
It's vaguely familiar, but I don't remember the geography well enough. I just remember the 4 and 5.
Yeah. It was like 100 degrees out. It was like 85 that night, and we all had it was before everybody had air conditioning in Southern California. We had the windows closed, and we were just burning up. So we knew Richard Ramirez was going to come inside and get us. It's a weird time. But I'm trying to think about this now. That's the next thing. Anything else? All right, well, thanks for coming. And,